CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Africa loses at least $50 billion a year to illicit cash flows. It is clear that retaining these resources on the continent would greatly help finance its development. We must go beyond words to demonstrate our commitment to fighting corruption with a leap towards concrete action.
Leap towards concrete action in the fight against corruption. That was the call by African Union Commission Chairperson Musa Faki Mahamat at the just concluded 31st African Union Heads of State Summit in Noukchott-Mauritania. Now, riding on the 2018 theme of combating corruption, member states were urged to chart a sustainable path by taking the war on graft from words to action. However, with billions lost annually in domestic and international channels, just how committed are the continent's leaders in winning the fight against corruption? And can this battle that's dragged on for decades be eventually won? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Winning the fight against corruption is a prerequisite for our progress and prosperity. That was the sentiment coming out of the 31st African Union Heads of State Assembly that concluded this week in Mauritania. Indeed, corruption remains a major challenge for many African countries, with sub-Saharan Africa ranking as the worst affected region globally, according to Transparency International's annual Corruption Perception Index for 2017. Now, in its efforts to curb graft, the Union in January appointed Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari to champion the cause of anti-corruption on the continent. But this was not the first time corruption was topping the agenda at the African Union. In 2003, the Union adopted the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. And that same year, the United Nations adopted the Convention Against Corruption, acknowledging it as an insidious plague with a wide range of corrosive effects on societies. Now, 15 years later, Africa still disproportionately suffers from this corrosion. So why haven't we seen the results of this effort? Well, let's now delve into the complexities of fighting corruption in Africa. I have my panel of guests in Lagos, Dr. Oladiran Bello. He's joining us from the Good Governance Africa, where he is the country executive director. In Johannesburg is Gideon Chitanga, a political analyst and researcher with the Center for the Study of Democracy. And with me here in studio, Mr. Raphael Tuju. He's the Secretary General of the Jubilee Party and a Cabinet Secretary without portfolio. Gentlemen, thank you very much all for joining us on the program. I want to get your thoughts from the African Union perspective here. And Mr. Tuju, I'll start off with you. The African Union theme for 2018 is winning the fight against corruption. Now, according to the Corruption Perception Index for 2017, South Africa is ranked at number 71, Kenya 143, Nigeria 148, quite low out of about 180 countries surveyed. Now, for Kenya, is this indication of corruption or is it a misperception?
Well, you used the word complex, and complex indeed it is. When you're talking about perceptions, of course, this involves the interviewing of Kenyans. I think somebody has to look at the instrument which is used for this kind of research and therefore be able to discuss its validity. We are not in the denial frame of mind as far as corruption is concerned. There is a challenge of corruption in this country. The president of this country has committed himself to fighting small-time corruption and big-time corruption. Of course, the corruption which affects the normal man, the normal man in the street, usually they'll talk about the policemen demanding bribes for them for, to harass them in various ways. And that really increases people's perception as to the amount of corruption in the government. If people looking for services, maybe to get a birth certificate or get a death certificate, and in each of these they need to pay a bribe to, civil servants, right, then it definitely creates that perception that things are really bad here. But when you're talking about corruption, I mean, it's a very elastic thing. I mean, I've lived in the United States, and there's something they call lobbying. Now, lobbying and corruption, the boundary is very thin. This is a global problem. Let
me rope in the other gentleman, because I do want to get Nigeria's feedback here, because Dr. Bello, President Buhari is actually at the forefront in fighting corruption and has made that a mantra in his administration. But Nigeria is still ranking something like at number 148 in the corruption perception index. Just how bad is it?
Well, I mean, I think Nigeria's corruption problem, is there, is quite glaring. It's a challenge. The president himself took power in 2015, saying it's an existential challenge. If Nigeria doesn't kill corruption, corruption would kill Nigeria. But I also know that this government has felt indignant in the way that perhaps they think this, Transparency International ranking and other perception of corruption indices have not really taken on board what the government thinks quite commendable steps it's taken to rein in corruption.
Right.
But I think, the people who have the perception that corruption is still prevalent and the government that protests that its effort is not being recognized, they're both right. And I think we'll begin to see movement if we start to focus on what I think are the procedural aspects of anti-corruption fight.
Right.
Which I think at the moment we're hardly broaching.
Mr. Chitanga, your thoughts on that and particularly South Africa's situation?
In South Africa, I think we saw a new phenomenon since 1994 where corruption played out in institution of government with during the government of President Zuma. And in Zimbabwe, I think that corruption has been pervasive, and there's a pattern there that you can associate with current countries in conflict, as well as countries that have had these big men leaders. And these leaders, the government, become so opaque that what happens inside institutions of government, it does not filter through to the public. There is another factor which is associated with tendering process. In South Africa, they call it tenderpreneurship, where key elites in government and sometimes in opposition political parties who are people who are connected simply filter through capital that goes into government, and they become gatekeepers and extract reins from the process of either investment or government processes.
Right. Mr. Tuju, we're hearing that this is a pervasive problem across the continent, though, and the perception index also did mention that in East Africa, for instance, 90% of the population no longer even reports bribery instances. Is there a feeling, though, that corruption now on the continent has become normalized, has become entrenched, as we've heard in Nigeria's case, in South Africa's case, and as you mentioned earlier, in Kenya's case?
Well, this is a matter of public morality to some extent. Take the case of you go to see a doctor and they look at you and they say, well, maybe if I pull out the appendix out of this lady, then I'll be able to charge some good fee from this particular patient. I mean, you need not go through this operation, but we found situations in which you have this kind of thing happening in some of our hospitals, not in Kenya, but also in Africa, for that matter. So it's really a public morality issue. It is all of us. I worked as a journalist, and I know that when I worked as a journalist at one time, I don't know what the situation is today, the pay was so low that journalists looked forward to the time when they would cover a politician, in which case they'll be able to come out with some brown envelopes.
Which is why I'm asking, though, has it become normalized then in this instance?
That's precisely. That's what I'm getting. I'm in agreement with you that maybe some of the reporting is no longer taking place because it's so much part of us, and there's a lot of work to be done.
Right. Dr. Olabello, when you look at this kind of situation, though, who are the biggest beneficiaries to this corruption? Is it the elite? Is it the general public? Because if it is going unreported, then who are the biggest beneficiaries?
Well, as my colleague has mentioned, this is a societal problem. People talk about petty corruption, people talk about grand corruption. I think these are all different dimensions of the problem that we as Africans have to tackle. It's true that corruption exists in every society, but I'm convinced that the way we've seen it manifested in the African context sometimes represents an existential threat to development and social inclusion and the advancements of humanity on this continent. So we must remove the opportunities that allow people to be corrupt without clear sanctions. And I think very importantly, I also have to emphasize that when we condemn corruption, I think we as a society and our leaders, as those we've empowered, also have a responsibility to better look after our public servants, because it simply makes no sense to pay a Nigerian civil servant a salary that's just about $80 a month in a city where that can hardly buy you 2 decent meals. I think when you have that sort of situation, it becomes difficult to tackle corruption and just simply wish it would go away.
Mr. Chitanga, in terms of South Africa itself, former President Jacob Zuma is currently facing about 783 corruption charges against him. So how exactly does this compromise the fight against corruption down there in South Africa?
People in power, when they create such dominance as to overshadow institutions of government and oversight institutions, they create a platform through which they exercise corruption without being held accountable. And unfortunately, when that happens, other sections of society also get implicated in this process, and institutions which were supposed to protect society also become corrupted. So the case of the presidents of Jacob Zuma reflects a leader who became so dominant in a young democracy and then tend to use his power to accumulate what one colleague called primitive accumulation. But the unique thing about South Africa, it has a strong civil society, and I think by and large its government institutions are still very functional. And there is a huge middle class and a vibrant private sector that does not necessarily depend on the state for its survival or for its core business to generate profit and expand business. And if you have such a society, then these institutions have a way of countervailing each other. And so the occupants or the individual actors who drive these institutions can in a way be held accountable. So I think that South Africa has the potential to build on the tragic presidents of Zuma in terms of the corruption that we witnessed through the Gupta Gate, to further invest in its institutions and make them even stronger so it can deal with corruption at the level of government.
Mr. Chitanga, you have mentioned a very interesting point about South African institutions and the strength of South African institutions in putting corruption in check. Kenya has recently decided to ask its civil servants and its high-level government officials, public officials to call them that, to undergo lifestyle auditing, to ascertain exactly what is missing and what is not missing here. How's that going? And exactly what will be expected to happen after that?
Well, that was a very bold statement from the president of intent, and it is not new. This has been something which was there from about more than 10 years ago. It's only that it was not being adhered to. I think the step, the president has taken that very bold step, and it has to start from somewhere. I mean, we can throw our hands in the air and say, forget it. This thing is so systemic that we cannot do anything about it. So it starts from the top, but also it needs support from the bottom.
But you have mentioned that this is something that has not been enforced over 10 years. So what exactly is Kenya's problem here? What is the challenge in enforcing those, those laws that were already there, and also in putting its corruption in check?
When I started at the beginning, I said it is complex. It is, a conspiracy of factors. You have ethnic issues, you have poverty issues, you have cultural issues, you have education issues, you have social, the way people have been socialized. I mean, in this country today, when you talk to young people in their 20s and 30s, you ask them, what would you want to do? They tell you, I want to have a good deal. The culture of working seems to have disappeared from somewhere. So there are many factors. It is not just one reason.
So the lifestyle audit will be expected To do what exactly if it is an entrenched situation, as you mentioned?
Well, I mean, for example, if my salary is 200,000 Kenya shillings and I own a property which is worth 100 million Kenya shillings, then I should be able to explain to people how did I get it.
All right, gentlemen, do stay with us for the moment. We are taking a short break now, but when we come back, we'll have more insights on Africa's fight against corruption and the international dimension in the battle. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, the fight against corruption is not an exclusively African affair. Globally, countries are struggling to eradicate graft, with the United Nations reporting that moving up from the lowest end of the corruption scale up to just the middle could result in increased investment by up to 8% of a country's GDP, thereby reducing extreme poverty, creating employment and enhancing efficiency in public service. Now, China is one such country that has declared corruption a major obstacle towards development. Our correspondent Girum Chala sat down with the Chinese ambassador to the African Union, Ambassador Kwang Weilin, to share China's experiences with Africa in its battle against corruption. Let's listen in to excerpts from the interview.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kwang Weilin, for talking to CGTN. Now, the African Union for this year of 2018 has decided the motto of winning the battle against corruption to be worked on throughout the year. From China's experience, for you, what do you think Africa can take as a lesson when it comes to battling corruption and winning the fight?
Corruption certainly is the #1 enemy in China. It has done a lot of damage to the society, to the country, and even to the party. And so without winning the battle against corruption, I don't think we can go very far in our development. That is why the party has decided to do everything it can to fight against the corruption. We have launched a nationwide campaign against corruption. A lot of laws and regulations have been promulgated. The system of supervision has been established to monitor the officials. So I think that the campaign has been successful. Now I think that the corruption has very much has been contained to some extent. So we are very much satisfied with what we have achieved, and we will continue to do so, because without winning the battle, we cannot continue our reform and open up. And in this regard, I think that we are very much willing to share our experience with African countries. I understand not long ago we had a delegation from China, led by a very high official in charge of the anti-corruption campaign. He had a very good discussions with the AU officials, and both sides agreed that we would enhance cooperation in this field. And I think that the theme of the African Union of the year this time is the fight against the corruption. I think it's timely and important for Africa. And as we have seen many reports that corruption has really, has done so much damage to the country, to the continent. So I think that we hope that the Africans, the campaign against corruption, will be successful.
That was China's ambassador to the African Union speaking to our correspondent in Addis Ababa. Now let's continue with our discussion. I still have my expert guests standing by, Dr. Olabello in Lagos, Nigeria, Gideon Chitanga in Johannesburg, South Africa, and with me in studio, Secretary General of the Jubilee Party and Cabinet Secretary without portfolio, Honorable Raphael Tuju. Dr. Olabello, start off with you though, because that is China's experience in fighting corruption, but there are success stories as well on the continent. According to the Corruption Perception Index, Botswana is topping the African continent at number 34, Seychelles number 36, Cape Verde number 48, and Rwanda as well, 48 of the countries surveyed. So what is it that these countries are getting right that is quite defeatist for countries like Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria?
I mean, you've mentioned a diversity of countries there, and I think every individual country, has its own experience in terms of how you deal with corruption. I suspect in the case of Rwanda, they're actually setting for us the example that I think we all now need to grasp onto and try and use as something to rein in corruption, which is that you create clear sanctions for infringements bordering on corruption. And I think this is where Africa's anti-corruption war is failing in particular, whether you talk about corruption within the civil service and some of the grand corruption in state administration, as we've mentioned. I think internally, it would also be fair that as we apply sanction, it will be realistic to also tighten some of the bolts and nuts in terms of the procedures around procurement and all of those things. I'm often astounded that when we talk about anti-corruption in Africa, my colleague mentioned the cultural dimension. A lot of people will tell you that some of the way we do procurement and award contract, they're not clearly at arm's length. And a lot of the time people simply think this is not a problem as long as the money doesn't disappear and the road gets built. But the other side of the argument is, can we get this, at better value for money, through more competitive contract awarding processes.
Right.
So we must do all of those nuts and bolts anti-corruption things, and I think this is where Africa needs the next big push.
Dr. Olabello, another pointer from you though, because in terms of Nigeria's situation, Nigeria is now currently repatriating some funds from Swiss banks and other foreign banks, and former President Sani Abacha actually had about $1.2 billion in a Swiss bank that is currently being repatriated, but that is actually 20 years later. So what is the missing link though here? How complicit is the Western institutions though when it comes to helping Africa fight this corruption scourge?
I mean, the complicity is very clear. We have a saying here in Nigeria that, if you have nowhere to take it, you're unlikely to steal it. And I think oftentimes those who accept the proceeds of corruption are probably just as guilty as the people who originally orchestrated. Nigerians were livid sometime during the David Cameron twilight days in power, when he talked about Nigeria as one of the fantastically corrupt country whose leader they've gathered in London. I think on the one hand is right. The other part of the equation, of course, is that much of this money is stashed away in banks in London and Switzerland and other places, as you've mentioned. So that international dimension is important. But most crucially, let me also emphasize the mutual responsibility we have to each other here in Africa. When you hear about South Sudanese generals simply cutting away money for development from South Sudan to buy houses in Nairobi, Kenya, in Kampala and elsewhere, it's not as if the government of the country where these properties are being bought are not aware of it. This is where I would like to see African leaders demonstrate that political will you talked about at the beginning, but also offering practical help to each other in terms of helping to repatriate the proceeds of corruption, but also creating the deterrent so that people who are tempted to steal at home know that they're not likely to get away with it. Right. And on the other side, there would not be people welcoming them with an open hand.
Mr. Tuju, that has been an issue, of course, with when it comes to South Sudanese property that might probably be here in the country and sanctions and so forth. But the complicity, though, between Western banks, Western institutions in terms of finding that money that African leaders, former leaders or whoever officials have in foreign banks, as well as assisting, as Olabello says, fellow African countries in finding their own money?
Well, that's one of the reasons why when you talk about the indices, I take them with a pinch of salt, and I'm in some ways very cynical about them, because handling of stolen property is part and parcel of being a thief. And all these Western banks which are handling this money are part and parcel of the problem. I hope that very soon we'll see an index, some indices on which Western banks are most involved in keeping some of this stolen money. We do have an anti-money laundering department in our own government, and trying to trace some of this money coming from the neighboring countries like South Sudan, which has got problems. And this is not something which only Kenya should do. I mean, you have South Sudanese in Canada, you have South Sudanese in the United States, you have South Sudanese, lots of them settled in Australia, in Uganda, all over the world, in Europe. And if we're really serious that we want to close in, then it has to be an international soup.
Right. Gideon Chitanga, I'm going to be winding up in a moment, and I want to get your thoughts here, because we have talked about the complexities and how each individual country is fighting corruption. So exactly for the continent, as the African Union asks us to take a leap, what should be the solutions here? What should be the continent-wide solutions? And how exactly should the African Union be implementing this?
I think there is light at the end of the tunnel. And for me, the fundamental point is that political leaders represent a sense of leadership to society. And so political will becomes very important in that respect. So a stronger political will to deal with corruption, particularly at government level, is symbolically and practically can be an example to the larger society that corruption is an unacceptable scourge. And that can complement all the other things that colleagues have mentioned. But let's start with a strong willingness at the political level. And at the continental level, that also would beef in terms of creating norms that are practically enforceable. You have mechanisms that we can follow up on to deal with corruption. Corruption must be policed and must be seen to be criminalized. These are common practice that we see people talking against corruption, but at the same time, in the public eye,
right,
they represent corruption, and their posture give an impression that corruption is very profitable and society can start to exalt it. It's very unfortunate. And this is why I'm emphasizing that at the leadership level, and particularly at political leadership, corruption must be nipped in the bud. It must be policed and penalized and punished instantly.
Right.
So then that those kids that are coming through the school system can see that this is not fair and it's not acceptable.
Thank you very much for being on the program, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us here on Talk Africa. Mr. Raphael Tuju, Secretary General of the Jubilee Party and Cabinet Secretary without portfolio. And also, that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests, Dr. Oladiran Bello, Executive Director of Good Governance Africa in Lagos, Gideon Chitanga, Political Analyst and Researcher with the Center for Study of Democracy in Johannesburg. And now remember to keep the conversation going online through our Facebook and Twitter handles. And you can also catch the episode on the CGTN Africa website and our YouTube playlist. Do tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, goodbye.